In the early years of the 19th century, when the young United States had just doubled its size through the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, there existed a vast, largely unmapped wilderness stretching from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean. This immense territory, covering more than 800,000 square miles, represented one of the last great frontiers on Earth, a land of towering mountain ranges, endless prairies, roaring rivers, and forests so dense that sunlight barely reached the forest floor. It was a landscape of extraordinary beauty and unforgiving harshness, where summer temperatures could soar above 100 degrees and winter cold could plunge to 40 below zero, where grizzly bears weighing half a ton roamed freely, and where survival required skills, knowledge, and toughness that few possessed. Into this wilderness ventured a particular breed of men who would become known as mountain men, individuals who chose to leave behind the relative safety and comfort of civilization to pursue lives of extreme solitude, constant danger, and remarkable freedom. These were not desperate refugees fleeing persecution or poverty, though some certainly came from humble origins. Rather, they were men drawn by something deeper, an attraction to the wild places that called to them with irresistible force, promising adventure, independence, and the opportunity to test themselves against nature in its most raw and powerful forms. They were trappers primarily, seeking the valuable pelts of beaver and other fur-bearing animals that commanded high prices in the markets of the East and Europe. But they were also explorers, traders, guides, and survivors who would play crucial roles in opening the American West to settlement, and whose knowledge of the land would prove invaluable to the nation's expansion. The mountain men emerged during a specific historical moment when several factors converged to create both the opportunity and the demand for their unique way of life. European fashion in the early 1800s prized beaver fur above all other materials for making hats, particularly the tall top hats that wealthy gentlemen wore as symbols of status and refinement. A single beaver pelt might fetch $6 to $8 in St. Louis, a substantial sum when a laborer might earn only $1 per day. The demand seemed insatiable, with hatters purchasing more than 100,000 beaver pelts annually, creating a powerful economic incentive for anyone willing to venture into the wilderness to trap these animals. At the same time, the Lewis and Clark expedition of 1804 to 1806 had returned with tantalizing reports of the West's geography, resources, and potential, firing the imagination of entrepreneurs and adventurers alike. The expedition's journals described rivers teeming with beaver, mountain ranges that challenged comprehension, and native peoples whose cultures fascinated and sometimes intimidated the explorers. The fur trade itself had ancient roots, stretching back to the earliest days of European contact with North America, when French voyageurs paddled their canoes through the Great Lakes and up the rivers of Canada, trading with indigenous peoples for pelts. The British Hudson's Bay Company, established in 1670, had built an empire on fur, creating trading posts across vast territories and developing sophisticated systems for collecting, processing, and transporting furs to European markets. But the Mountain Man era represented something different from these earlier patterns of fur trading. Rather than establishing permanent posts and waiting for Native Americans to bring furs to them, the mountain men penetrated deep into unexplored territories, living year-round in the wilderness, trapping the animals themselves, and creating a new model of frontier commerce that was more mobile, more independent, and more dangerous than anything that had come before. The men who became mountain men came from diverse backgrounds, though certain patterns emerged. Many hailed from Kentucky, that borderland state where the settled East met the wild frontier, where boys grew up learning to hunt, track, and survive in woods that still held wolves and bears. Kentucky produced an outsized number of famous mountain men, including Kit Carson, who would become perhaps the most legendary figure of them all. Others came from Virginia, Missouri, Pennsylvania, and even from as far away as New England, drawn westward by stories of adventure and fortune. Some were educated, literate men who kept journals and wrote letters describing their experiences. Others were illiterate or barely schooled, their knowledge coming from experience rather than books. Some were white Americans of European descent, but the mountain men also included French Canadians who brought generations of fur trading expertise, men of mixed Native American and European heritage who moved easily between different cultural worlds, and even freed African Americans like Jim Beckworth, who would become a war chief among the Crow people. What united these diverse individuals was a willingness to embrace a life that most people would have considered impossibly difficult and dangerous. A mountain man had to be comfortable spending months entirely alone, or with only one or two companions, far from any settlement, with no possibility of help if things went wrong. He had to possess extraordinary physical toughness, capable of walking or riding 50 miles in a day over rough terrain, of withstanding extreme cold with inadequate clothing, of going days without food when hunting was poor, of setting his own broken bones or treating his own wounds when no doctor was available for hundreds of miles. He needed to develop an intimate knowledge of nature, learning to read weather signs to avoid being caught in deadly storms, to identify edible plants that could supplement his diet, to track animals through forests and across plains, to find water in seemingly waterless lands. He had to become proficient with the weapons of his era, the muzzle-loading rifles and pistols that required careful maintenance and skillful use, capable of hitting a target at long range with a single shot, because there would be no time to reload if that shot missed and a grizzly bear was charging. Beyond physical skills and toughness, the mountain man needed psychological qualities that were perhaps even more rare. He had to be able to endure long periods of solitude without losing his sanity, to maintain his composure when facing life-threatening danger, to make critical decisions quickly when there was no one to consult and when the wrong choice might mean death. He needed a certain flexibility of mind, an ability to adapt to circumstances that could change rapidly and unpredictably. A man who was too rigid in his thinking, too attached to doing things a certain way, would not survive long in an environment that constantly presented new challenges, requiring improvised solutions. At the same time, he needed discipline and self-control, the ability to plan ahead, to conserve resources, to avoid taking foolish risks just for excitement. The mountain man, who survived for years rather than months, had learned to balance boldness with caution, to know when to push forward and when to retreat, to distinguish between acceptable risks and suicide missions. The journey westward for a would-be mountain man typically began in St. Louis, that gateway city on the Mississippi River where the civilized world ended and the frontier began. St. Louis in the 1820s and 30s was a rough, bustling place, filled with riverboats and warehouses, with traders and trappers, with saloons and stores selling everything a man might need for a journey into the wilderness. Here, the major fur companies maintained their headquarters, operations like the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, founded by William Ashley and Andrew Henry, or John Jacob Astor's massive American Fur Company, which sought to dominate the entire Western fur trade. Young men seeking adventure would present themselves to these companies, hoping to be hired as trappers, or at least as camp helpers, who might eventually earn the right to trap on their own. The companies offered different arrangements depending on a man's experience and circumstances. Some trappers worked directly for wages, receiving supplies and equipment from the company in exchange for agreeing to trap for them and turn over all the pelts they caught. These men were essentially employees, with little independence, but also little financial risk. Others became what were called free trappers, independent operators who bought their own equipment, trapped wherever they chose, and sold their furs to whoever offered the best price. Free trappers bore all the risks themselves. They might return from a season with nothing to show for their efforts, having lost their traps to floods or their pelts to thieves, but they also kept all the profits if things went well. The successful free trapper could make substantial sums, enough to outfit himself in style or to invest in business ventures. though many chose to spend their earnings on whiskey and celebration as soon as they reached civilization, living for the moment rather than planning for an uncertain future. Before departing for the mountains, a trapper needed to equip himself with the tools and supplies necessary for survival. The most important item was his rifle, typically a heavy caliber weapon of the type that came to be called a Hawken rifle, named for the St. Louis gunsmiths who perfected this design. These rifles were shorter and more robust than the long rifles used in the East, better suited to the rigors of mountain travel and to the need for powerful stopping power against large, dangerous animals. A mountain man's rifle was his most prized possession, cared for with meticulous attention, cleaned and oiled regularly, protected from moisture and damage. Many trappers gave their rifles names and spoke of them almost as though they were living companions, recognizing that their lives depended absolutely on this tool functioning properly when needed most. Beyond his rifle, a trapper carried pistols, usually a pair for backup, along with a substantial supply of gunpowder, lead for casting bullets, and flints for the firing mechanism. He needed a knife, and not just one, but several, large hunting knives for butchering game and defending himself in close quarters, smaller knives for detail work. A tomahawk served multiple purposes, useful as a weapon, a tool for cutting wood, and a hammer when needed. Traps themselves were essential equipment, heavy iron leg-hold traps with powerful springs that could break a man's hand if he wasn't careful setting them, designed to catch and hold a beaver or other fur-bearing animal until the trapper could retrieve it. A mountain man might carry a dozen or more traps, each weighing several pounds, adding substantial weight to his pack or to the load his pack animals carried. Clothing represented another critical category of equipment, and here the mountain man adopted a style that would become iconic in American culture. Buckskin, leather made from deer hide, became the standard material for shirts, pants, and moccasins. Buckskin had many advantages over cloth. It was durable, resistant to thorns and rough use, relatively waterproof when properly treated, and it could be repaired in the field using only a needle and thread made from sinew. A buckskin outfit could last for years with proper care, though it would become increasingly filthy, greasy, and odoriferous as time passed. Mountain men typically wore their buckskins until they literally fell apart, then made new ones from fresh hides when necessary. The process of preparing and sewing buckskin garments was time-consuming and required skill, and many mountain men either learned these skills from Native American women or married into tribes, partly to gain access to such expertise. Additional equipment included a buffalo robe, an enormously heavy but wonderfully warm blanket made from the thick winter coat of a bison, essential for surviving frigid mountain nights. Cooking gear consisted of a metal pot or kettle, a frying pan, perhaps a coffee pot for those who could afford coffee. Personal items might include a blanket or two, extra clothing, needles and thread, a whetstone for sharpening knives and axes, flint and steel for starting fires, a horn for carrying gunpowder, a leather pouch for carrying bullets and other small items. Some men carried books, typically a Bible or perhaps a volume of Shakespeare, something to read during long winter evenings. Others brought musical instruments, fiddles or harmonicas, to provide entertainment in camp. The total weight of all this equipment could easily exceed 100 pounds, requiring pack animals to transport, unless a man was traveling by canoe or boat on one of the western rivers. The overland journey from St. Louis to the Rocky Mountains covered more than 800 miles and typically took 2 to 3 months, following routes that would eventually become famous trails. Early expeditions traveled up the Missouri River as far as possible, using keelboats that could be rowed, poled, or even pulled upstream by men walking along the riverbank with ropes. This was backbreaking labor, moving against the current of one of the continent's mightiest rivers, fighting sandbars and sawyers, those deadly submerged logs that could hole a boat in seconds, watching constantly for hostile Native American groups who controlled the river and sometimes demanded tribute from travelers passing through their territory. As the fur trade developed, overland routes became more common, with traders and trappers traveling with pack trains of horses and mules across the prairies, and through the mountain passes. The journey itself provided the first test of whether a man had what it took to survive as a mountain man. The prairies seemed endless, stretching in all directions with no landmarks to guide by except the sun and stars, with grass sometimes tall enough to hide a man on horseback. Water could be scarce, with days passing between reliable sources, forcing travelers to carry what they could and to ration it carefully. The weather was unpredictable and often violent, with thunderstorms rolling across the plains with terrifying power, lightning striking so close that the air crackled with electricity, hail falling large enough to kill unprotected animals. Tornadoes occasionally formed, visible for miles as they marched across the landscape, destroying anything in their paths. The sun beat down with relentless intensity in summer, turning the prairies into an oven where men and animals suffered from heat exhaustion and dehydration. As travelers approached the Rocky Mountains, the landscape changed dramatically. The prairies gave way to rolling hills, then to genuine mountains whose snow-capped peaks rose thousands of feet into the sky. Forests of pine and spruce covered the slopes, interspersed with open meadows filled with wildflowers in summer. Streams tumbled down from the heights, cold and clear, filled with trout. Elk and deer grazed in the meadows, while grizzly bears patrolled their territories, apex predators who feared nothing and would attack humans if surprised, or if they had cubs to protect. This was the mountain man's domain, the place where he would spend the next months or years, learning its secrets, mastering its challenges, and either making his fortune or dying in the attempt. The actual work of beaver trapping required knowledge, skill, patience, and a willingness to spend hours wading in icy mountain streams. Beaver were nocturnal animals who spent their nights busy with construction projects, cutting down trees with their powerful teeth, building and maintaining the dams that created the ponds where they lived. They were also territorial and used scent marking to claim their domains, a behavior that trappers learned to exploit. The basic technique involved setting leg-hold traps underwater near beaver trails or feeding areas, positioning them carefully so that a beaver following its usual path would step on the trigger mechanism and be caught. The trap was anchored with a heavy stick or stone, designed to let the trapped beaver swim toward deep water where it would drown, preventing it from escaping and avoiding the risk that it might gnaw off its own foot to escape. To lure beaver to the trap, mountain men used castor, a secretion from the beaver's scent glands that they harvested from previously trapped animals and stored in small bottles or horns. A small amount of this castor would be placed on a stick positioned near the trap, creating a scent that other beaver would investigate, believing that a strange beaver had invaded their territory. The territorial instinct was strong enough that beaver would approach even when it meant danger, and if the trap was well placed and properly concealed, the curious beaver would step into it and be caught. Successful beaver trapping required understanding beaver behavior, reading sign to determine where beaver were most active, placing traps in exactly the right locations, and checking them regularly to retrieve caught animals before their pelts were damaged by being in the water too long. The work was conducted in conditions that most people would find unbearable. Mountain men typically trapped in spring and fall, seasons when beaver fur was at its finest, but when water temperatures were brutally cold, barely above freezing and sometimes containing ice. A trapper would wade into these streams before dawn, when temperatures were coldest, spending hours setting and checking traps, working with hands so cold that they lost feeling, developing what he hoped was enough tolerance to avoid the frostbite that could cost him fingers or toes. After checking his trap line, he would have to skin and flesh the beaver he had caught, a messy, time-consuming process that required skill to avoid damaging the valuable pelt. The skins were then stretched on willow hoops or frames to dry, treated to prevent rot, and eventually pressed and bundled for transport. A successful trapper working a good territory might catch 300 to 400 beaver in a season, an impressive haul worth perhaps $2,000 or more when sold at Rendezvous or brought to market in St. Louis. However, this success required constant work and brought constant risk. Rivers could flood without warning, sweeping away carefully set traps, or drowning a man who couldn't reach shore in time. Grizzly bears were attracted to the smell of blood and dead beaver, leading to terrifying encounters when a trapper returned to his camp to find a half-ton predator claiming his catch. Native American groups sometimes attacked trappers, either because they resented white men taking beaver from their traditional territories, or simply because trappers made attractive targets, typically isolated, heavily burdened with valuable equipment, and outnumbered. Disease was a constant threat in an era before antibiotics, with simple infections capable of killing a man who had no access to medical care. Beyond trapping, the mountain man needed to secure food for himself, a task that occupied considerable time and energy. Game was often abundant. Deer and elk could be found in most mountain areas, while buffalo herds covered the plains in numbers that seemed infinite. However, hunting success was never guaranteed. Animals migrated with the seasons, following the grass or moving to lower elevations when winter snows grew too deep. A region that teemed with game in summer might be nearly empty in winter, forcing trappers to move constantly in search of food, or to prepare large stores of dried meat when hunting was good. The meat preservation techniques used by mountain men were adopted largely from Native American practices, cutting meat into thin strips that were dried in the sun or smoked over fires to create jerky that could be stored for months and would remain edible even in the heat of summer. Bison proved particularly valuable as a food source. The meat was excellent, the tongue considered a delicacy, while the hide provided robes for warmth and leather for various uses. The fat from a buffalo's hump could be rendered and used for cooking or for waterproofing leather. The bones could be cracked to extract the marrow, a concentrated source of calories and nutrients. Mountain men learned to use virtually every part of the animals they killed, wasting nothing because waste might mean starvation if hunting turned poor later. This efficiency reflected both practical necessity and a certain respect for the animals that sustained them, an understanding that they were dependent on the natural world in the most fundamental way and had to take from it wisely rather than wastefully. Fish provided another important food source, particularly during seasons when large game was scarce. Mountain streams and lakes held various species of trout, often in impressive numbers, in waters that had never been fished. Mountain men would catch fish using hooks and line, would spear them in shallow water, or would even build weirs and traps similar to those used by Native Americans to catch migrating fish in large quantities. Fish had the advantage of being available even in winter when other food might be impossible to find, though ice fishing required tools and patience as men chipped through thick ice to reach the water below. Plant foods supplemented the heavily meat-based diet, though most mountain men lacked the botanical knowledge that Native American peoples possessed. Berries were collected when in season, various roots could be dug and eaten, and some men learned to recognize other edible plants from native people. However, plant foods were generally seen as supplements rather than staples, something to add variety and nutrition rather than primary sources of calories. The mountain man's diet was heavy in protein and fat, light on carbohydrates and vitamins, a combination that kept men strong, but could lead to various nutritional deficiencies over time. Scurvy, caused by lack of vitamin C, was a constant danger during long winters when fresh food was unavailable. Trappers who developed scurvy saw their teeth loosen and their gums bleed, felt overwhelming fatigue, and could die if they didn't get fresh food soon enough. The shelters mountain men built for themselves varied depending on circumstances, season, and personal preference. Some constructed log cabins, small structures chinked with mud to keep out wind and weather, usually built near good trapping territories where a man planned to spend extended time. These cabins were crude by the standards of settled areas, often just a single room with a dirt floor, a fireplace, and perhaps a raised platform for sleeping, but they provided critical protection from winter cold and served as secure bases for operations. Other men preferred more temporary camps, building lean-tos from pine boughs or simply sleeping under buffalo robes beneath the stars, moving camp frequently to follow the beaver, or to avoid staying in one place long enough to be tracked by hostile forces. Winter camps required more substantial shelter, as temperatures could drop to levels that would kill an unprotected person in hours. Some trappers would seek out caves or natural rock shelters that provided protection from wind and precipitation. Others built semi-permanent structures in sheltered valleys, where deep snow would insulate them from the worst cold. These winter camps became home for months at a time, from when the first heavy snows fell in, October or November, until spring thaw in April or May. During this period, trapping was difficult or impossible, and trappers focused on survival, on maintaining their equipment, on hunting when weather permitted, on simply enduring until warmer weather returned. The isolation of these winter camps was profound, with men sometimes going months without seeing another human being, left alone with their thoughts in a white wilderness that seemed to stretch forever in all directions. Fire was essential for survival, providing warmth, allowing food to be cooked, offering light in the darkness, and serving as protection against predators that feared flames. Mountain men became expert at building and maintaining fires under challenging conditions, coaxing flames from damp wood, nursing fires through heavy rain or snow, banking fires at night so they could be easily rekindled in the morning. Wood smoke became a constant companion, permeating clothing and hair, stinging eyes. But these discomforts were accepted as necessary prices for the warmth and cooking ability that fire provided. The skill of reading smoke also became important, as smoke rising from a distant fire might indicate the presence of other trappers, Native American camps, or even hostile forces, requiring careful observation and appropriate caution. The dangers that mountain men faced were numerous and varied, ranging from immediate physical threats to longer-term risks that could accumulate over time. Grizzly bears represented perhaps the most terrifying danger, massive predators that could weigh 800 pounds or more, run as fast as a horse for short distances, and were notoriously difficult to kill even with well-placed rifle shots. Unlike the smaller black bears that could often be intimidated or driven off, grizzlies would sometimes attack humans without provocation, particularly if surprised at close range or if they had cubs nearby. Accounts of grizzly attacks filled mountain men's stories, tales of desperate fights where men used rifles, pistols, knives, and even tomahawks, trying to stop an enraged bear bent on killing them. The most famous grizzly attack in mountain man history involved Hugh Glass, a member of Ashley's expedition who was mauled by a grizzly bear near the Missouri River in 1823. The bear shattered his leg, tore open his throat, and ripped his back and shoulder so badly that the men with him were certain he would die. 2 men stayed with Glass while the rest of the party moved on, waiting for him to expire so they could bury him properly. However, after several days, convinced that Glass was as good as dead and worried about being attacked themselves, these men took Glass's rifle and equipment and abandoned him, leaving him alone and defenseless in hostile territory. Remarkably, Glass survived. He regained consciousness and over the following weeks crawled and stumbled more than 200 miles to reach Fort Kiowa, surviving on berries, roots, and scraps of meat from a buffalo calf killed by wolves. His survival became legendary, a testament to the incredible toughness and determination that characterized the best of the mountain men. Native American peoples represented both potential allies and potential threats, depending on the specific tribe, the circumstances of the encounter, and the actions of the trappers themselves. Some groups, such as the Shoshone, Nez Perce, and Flathead tribes, generally maintained friendly relations with American trappers, seeing them as trading partners and sometimes as allies against traditional enemies. These tribes would trade food, horses, and information for manufactured goods like knives, metal tools, and cloth. Many mountain men married into these friendly tribes, relationships that served practical purposes beyond companionship, providing trappers with native kinship networks, access to tribal knowledge, and safe haven when needed. Other groups, particularly the Blackfeet Confederation in the northern Rockies, and some bands of Arapaho and Sioux on the plains, viewed American trappers as intruders and enemies, attacking them whenever possible. The Blackfeet had long-standing trade relationships with British fur companies operating from Canada and saw American trappers as competition threatening their economic interests. They were also defending their traditional territories from what they correctly perceived as an invasion that would eventually lead to the destruction of their way of life. Encounters between mountain men and hostile Native American groups could be brief and deadly, with arrows striking without warning from ambush positions, or they could develop into running battles lasting hours as trappers tried to reach defensive positions or escape to safety. Mountain men learned to read signs of Native American presence, looking for tracks, smoke, or other indicators that might suggest whether groups were nearby and whether they were likely to be friendly or hostile. They developed tactical awareness born of necessity, never camping in obvious locations, always having escape routes planned, sleeping lightly with weapons close at hand. Some men traveled with native companions or within native villages for extended periods, essentially becoming honorary members of these communities. Others remained wary and isolated, trusting no one, seeing every encounter as potentially dangerous. The level of conflict varied by region and time period, with some areas remaining relatively safe for years, while others were essentially war zones where trappers moved in large, heavily armed groups for mutual protection. Weather posed constant challenges and could kill as surely as bear attacks or arrow wounds. Summer thunderstorms in the mountains came with terrifying rapidity, dark clouds boiling up seemingly from nowhere, lightning striking all around, rain falling in sheets that reduced visibility to a few feet. These storms could trigger flash floods that turned peaceful streams into raging torrents in minutes, sweeping away camps and drowning anyone caught in their path. Hail could fall with such violence that it killed exposed animals and could seriously injure or even kill people who couldn't find shelter. Winter storms were even more dangerous, bringing temperatures cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in minutes, winds that made it impossible to maintain body heat, and snow that fell so heavily that visibility dropped to zero, creating whiteout conditions where a man could become disoriented and lost within yards of his shelter. Frostbite was a constant winter risk, affecting extremities first as the body prioritized keeping the core warm at the expense of fingers, toes, ears, and nose. Mountain men learned to watch for the warning signs, the tingling sensation followed by numbness that indicated blood flow was being restricted. If caught early, frostbitten tissue could sometimes be saved by gradual rewarming, but severe cases resulted in tissue death, requiring amputation of affected parts to prevent gangrene from spreading. Many long-term trappers bore the marks of winter's toll, missing toes or fingers, ears reduced to stubs, noses permanently damaged. They considered these disfigurements simply the price of their chosen life, badges of survival rather than sources of shame. Hypothermia represented an even more immediate danger than frostbite, capable of killing in hours when conditions were severe. Mountain men who fell through ice into frigid water faced a desperate race against time, needing to reach shelter, get out of wet clothing, and warm themselves before their core body temperature dropped too low. Many did not make it, succumbing to the insidious effects of cold that first brought confusion and poor judgment, then drowsiness, and finally unconsciousness and death. Those who survived such ordeals spoke of it as a profoundly terrifying experience, feeling themselves slipping away while knowing that only their own desperate efforts could save them. Starvation loomed as a possibility whenever hunting failed for extended periods. A man could survive weeks without food, but the experience was agonizing as the body consumed its own muscle and fat, strength drained away, thinking became difficult, and even simple tasks required enormous effort. Mountain men caught in such circumstances would eat anything remotely digestible, boiling leather from their clothing or equipment to extract whatever nutrition it might offer, eating roots and bark, catching mice or insects, anything to get some calories into their bodies. Some resorted to eating their horses or mules when all other options had been exhausted, knowing this meant they would have to walk out carrying their equipment, but choosing survival over mobility. The rare cases where trappers were forced to cannibalism to survive became legendary horror stories, whispered in camps and used to illustrate the absolute extremes to which desperation could drive men. River crossings represented another significant danger, as many western rivers ran swift and deep, fed by snowmelt and rain. Mountain men needed to cross these rivers frequently while following trap lines or moving between territories, and each crossing carried risk. A man swept off his feet by the current might be carried downstream, dashed against rocks, drowned if he couldn't reach shore. Pack animals loaded with equipment were particularly vulnerable, as the weight they carried could drag them under if they lost their footing. Mountain men developed various techniques for managing river crossings, from building rafts to carry equipment, while swimming horses across to finding the shallowest fords where crossing was least dangerous. But no technique could eliminate the risk entirely. Disease struck without warning and could incapacitate or kill even the strongest men. Dysentery from contaminated water caused severe diarrhea that could lead to fatal dehydration if not treated. Various fevers burned through camps, likely caused by bacterial or viral infections that the era's medical knowledge couldn't identify or treat effectively. Mountain fever, probably a form of tick-borne illness, struck suddenly with high fever, severe headaches, and prostration that left men unable to care for themselves. Infected wounds were particularly dangerous in an era before antibiotics, with even small cuts capable of becoming infected and spreading potentially fatal blood poisoning if not properly cleaned and cared for. Mountain men learned basic wound care, cleaning injuries with whiskey when available, applying poultices made from various plants that sometimes helped and sometimes did nothing, and praying that their body's natural defenses would fight off infection before it spread too far. Dental problems plagued mountain men as they did all people of the era, but with no access to dentists or even basic dental care. Toothaches could become excruciating, abscesses could form, and the only solution was often extraction performed by oneself or by a companion using whatever tools were available. Many mountain men eventually lost most or all of their teeth, relying on soft foods or on techniques like pounding dried meat to make it chewable. Poor dental health contributed to other health problems, making it difficult to eat properly and limiting nutritional intake at times when good nutrition was desperately needed. Despite all these dangers and hardships, or perhaps partly because of them, many mountain men came to love their lives in the wilderness with a passion that people living more conventional lives found difficult to understand. The freedom they experienced was unlike anything available in settled society. No one told them what to do or how to do it. No schedules constrained their days beyond the rhythms of nature and the requirements of survival. No social hierarchies determined their worth beyond their own abilities and accomplishments. A man was judged by what he could do, by his skill with a rifle, his endurance on the trail, his courage in danger, his resourcefulness in solving problems, not by his family name or his education or his property. This meritocracy appealed to many who had felt confined or diminished by the more rigid social structures of the East. The beauty of the wilderness itself called to something deep in many mountain men's souls. They witnessed sunrises over mountain ranges that took their breath away, stood beneath more stars than they had ever seen, watched wildlife in numbers and varieties that astonished them. They found places of transcendent beauty that no white man had ever seen, valleys where meadows stretched for miles, waterfalls thundering down from impossible heights, caves filled with formations that looked like frozen fountains. Some mountain men developed deep appreciation for this beauty, speaking and writing of it in terms that revealed genuine love for the land. Others took it more for granted, but even these hardened, practical men would sometimes pause to watch an especially stunning sunset or to admire the grace of an eagle soaring overhead. The relationships mountain men formed with each other could become extraordinarily close, forged in shared danger and mutual dependence. Partners who spent months or years together, who had saved each other's lives in desperate situations, who had shared their last food and warmed each other through freezing nights, developed bonds that transcended normal friendship. These partnerships often crossed cultural and ethnic boundaries that would have been rare in more settled areas. White trappers partnered with men of Native American, French Canadian, or mixed heritage, bound together by shared experience rather than divided by differences in background. The stories mountain men told about their partners often revealed deep affection and respect, speaking of men they trusted absolutely and would have done anything to help. At the same time, the mountain man's life could be profoundly lonely, especially for those who trapped alone or who spent winters isolated in remote camps. The human need for social connection was strong, and extended periods without meaningful contact with others could weigh heavily on even the most independent spirits. Some men talked to themselves or to their horses and mules, needing to hear human speech even if it was only their own voice. Others carved figures or drawings into trees or rocks, leaving marks of their presence as a way of asserting their existence in a vast wilderness that could make a single human seem insignificant. The intense socializing that occurred at the annual rendezvous gatherings reflected this accumulated loneliness, as men who had been isolated for months suddenly found themselves among dozens or hundreds of others, leading to celebrations that could become wild and excessive. The rendezvous system, developed by William Ashley and refined over the years of the mountain fur trade, revolutionized how the business of trapping was conducted. Rather than requiring trappers to make the long, dangerous journey back to St. Louis every year to sell their furs and resupply, the rendezvous brought the market to them. Each summer, typically in late June or July, a supply caravan would depart from St. Louis loaded with trade goods. This caravan included trappers returning from the previous year, new recruits hoping to make their fortunes, and company representatives who would manage the trading operations. Pack trains of mules and horses carried thousands of pounds of supplies, everything from traps and rifles to cloth and beads, from coffee and sugar to whiskey and tobacco, from needles and thread to knives and hatchets. The caravan followed established routes across the prairies and through the mountains, a journey of several months that was itself an adventure filled with challenges. The animals required constant attention, becoming footsore or sick, wandering off at night despite hobbles and night guards, sometimes being stolen by Native Americans who saw horse theft as a legitimate way to acquire wealth and display bravery. The goods had to be protected from weather and from potential thieves, requiring organization and vigilance. The caravan moved slowly, perhaps 15 miles on a good day, less when terrain was difficult or when animals needed rest. The men who made this journey year after year developed tremendous expertise in managing pack trains, knowing how to load animals to distribute weight properly, how to recognize and treat common animal ailments, how to keep valuable goods secure during river crossings and through storms. The rendezvous location was typically selected well in advance and communicated to trappers through various means: word of mouth, messages left at known camps or landmarks, or simply the knowledge that certain locations had become traditional gathering spots. The Green River Valley, in what is now Wyoming, became the most common rendezvous site, hosting 6 of the 16 rendezvous held between 1825 and 1840. Other locations included Pierre's Hole, Jackson's Hole, and Cache Valley, all places where water, grass for animals, and game for feeding large gatherings of people could be found in abundance. These valleys became temporary cities each summer, with hundreds of trappers, thousands of Native Americans from various friendly tribes, company representatives, and later even missionaries and settlers converging for several weeks of trading, socializing, and celebration. The atmosphere at Rendezvous was unlike anything else in the American West. After months or even years of isolation and hardship, trappers arrived with their year's catch of beaver pelts and an intense desire to trade, drink, gamble, compete, tell stories, and generally release the tensions that had built up during their time in the Wilderness. Native American groups came to trade their own furs and to acquire manufactured goods that were difficult to obtain otherwise. Women from various tribes were present, some as traders in their own right, others accompanying husbands or family members. The gathering took on aspects of a fair, a market, a religious revival, and a massive party all rolled into one chaotic event that could become remarkably wild. Trading occurred throughout the rendezvous period, with trappers bringing their beaver pelts to company representatives who would inspect them, assess their quality, and offer payment. The standard unit was the made beaver, a prime pelt in excellent condition, which served as a kind of currency against which everything else was measured. A good trapper might have 200 or more made beaver to trade, representing a year's dangerous work. The prices paid for furs at rendezvous were typically less than what they would fetch in St. Louis, but the convenience of not having to make the long journey east made the price difference acceptable to most trappers. However, the prices charged for supplies at rendezvous were dramatically inflated compared to what the same goods would cost in St. Louis. The companies justified these high prices by pointing to the costs and risks of transporting goods across 1,000 miles of wilderness, and while this justification had some validity, the markups were often excessive, sometimes reaching several $100. A blanket that cost $3 in St. Louis might sell for $15 at rendezvous. Coffee and sugar commanded premium prices. Whiskey, which was often diluted and of questionable quality, cost several dollars a pint. Tobacco, cloth, beads, and other trade goods were similarly priced at levels that ensured substantial profits for the companies, while leaving trappers with much less purchasing power than the raw value of their furs might suggest. Many trappers found that after paying for the supplies they needed for the coming year, they had little left over despite having risked their lives and worked extraordinarily hard. Some even went into debt to the companies, receiving goods on credit against future catches, creating a cycle of dependence that was difficult to break. The companies, of course, benefited enormously from this arrangement, essentially controlling both the supply and demand sides of the equation and extracting maximum value from the trapper's labor. A few trappers wise enough or disciplined enough to avoid excessive celebration and careful enough in their trading could accumulate significant wealth, but many spent their earnings almost as fast as they made them, unable to resist the temptations of whiskey, gambling, and the various goods that seemed so attractive after long deprivation. Alcohol consumption at rendezvous was legendary, with tremendous quantities of whiskey being consumed over the course of the gathering. The whiskey was often barely deserving of the name, diluted with water, river water often enough that it carried significant health risks, and sometimes doctored with additives meant to increase its apparent strength or simply to stretch supplies further. Nevertheless, trappers and Native Americans alike would drink prodigious amounts, leading to behavior that ranged from boisterous celebration to violent confrontation. Fights were common, sometimes friendly competitions to see who was toughest, other times serious affairs where old grudges were settled or new ones created. Occasionally, these fights resulted in deaths, though the general atmosphere of celebration usually prevented escalation to that extreme. Gambling was another major activity at rendezvous, with various games of chance separating trappers from their hard-earned earnings. Card games ran continuously, with stakes that could include furs, equipment, horses, or anything else of value. Native Americans introduced various traditional gambling games, some involving dice made from bones or stones, others based on guessing games or hand signs. Trappers gambled on horse races, on shooting competitions, on virtually anything that could be wagered upon. Some men who had brought substantial catches to rendezvous left with almost nothing, having lost everything in reckless gambling sessions fueled by alcohol and the euphoria of being among people again after long isolation. Physical competitions provided entertainment and allowed trappers to demonstrate their skills and toughness. Shooting contests tested marksmanship, with competitors attempting to hit targets at various distances, sometimes for prizes, but often simply for bragging rights and reputation. Wrestling matches, sometimes between trappers and sometimes between trappers and Native American competitors, drew crowds of spectators who would wager on the outcomes. Horse racing was popular, with fine horses being bred and trained specifically for racing. Foot races tested speed and endurance. These competitions served important social functions beyond simple entertainment, allowing men to establish and maintain their status within the mountain man community through demonstrated prowess rather than through inherited position or wealth. Storytelling was elevated to an art form at Rendezvous, with trappers sharing tales of their adventures, encounters, and narrow escapes. These stories were often embellished, with each telling making the bear a little larger, the river a little wider, the escape a little more miraculous. However, embellishment was accepted and even expected, part of the entertainment value of the stories. Some mountain men became famous for their storytelling abilities, able to hold audiences spellbound with their narratives. These stories served to transmit information about territories, dangers, and opportunities, but they also built the mythology of the mountain man himself, creating legends that would outlive the actual fur trade era and shape how Americans understood their frontier heritage. The Native American presence at Rendezvous was substantial and essential to the event's character. Various tribes saw Rendezvous as an opportunity for trade, diplomacy, and social interaction with both trappers and other tribes. The Shoshone, who controlled much of the territory where rendezvous were held, came in large numbers, sometimes several thousand people camping near the main gathering. The Nez Perce traveled from their home territories in present-day Idaho and Washington, bringing horses that were among the finest in the West, prized by trappers for their strength and endurance. Flathead people came from Montana, while Crow from the northern plains sometimes attended despite the greater distances they had to travel. These Native American groups brought more than just trade goods to Rendezvous. They brought different perspectives, different knowledge systems, different ways of understanding and interacting with the natural world that often proved valuable to trappers willing to learn. They brought family structures and social organizations that some trappers chose to join through marriage. They brought diplomatic considerations that affected where trappers could safely travel and work. The complex relationships between various tribes, alliances, and enmities that had developed over generations or centuries created a political landscape that trappers had to navigate carefully. A trapper who was friends with the Crow might find himself unwelcome in Blackfeet territory, while someone who had married into a Shoshone band gained access to territories and assistance that would otherwise be unavailable. Marriage between trappers and Native American women was common and served practical purposes for both parties. For trappers, marriage provided domestic assistance that was genuinely valuable. Wives prepared and tanned hides, made and maintained clothing, gathered plant foods, and generally managed the day-to-day work of maintaining a camp. Native wives also provided linguistic and cultural translation, helping trappers understand and interact with their wife's people, offering access to tribal trade networks and diplomatic connections. For Native American women, marriage to a trapper could provide access to manufactured goods, prestige within their communities, and sometimes genuine affection and partnership. Some of these marriages were casual arrangements that lasted only a season or two, but others developed into lasting relationships where couples remained together for years or even decades, raising children who moved between Native American and white worlds. Children born from these unions faced complex identity questions, belonging fully to neither their father's world nor their mother's, often finding themselves in ambiguous positions within both societies. Some became trappers themselves, using their mixed heritage to advantage as they could move more easily between different cultural contexts. Others primarily identified with their mother's people, living within native communities and maintaining traditional ways of life. The mixed heritage population that developed in the Mountain West would eventually number in the thousands, creating communities and family networks that persisted long after the fur trade era ended, contributing to the ethnic and cultural diversity of the American West. The missionary presence at later rendezvous reflected broader changes occurring in American society and foreshadowed the end of the mountain man era. Protestant missionaries, driven by desires to convert Native Americans to Christianity and to bring what they saw as civilization to the wilderness, began attending rendezvous in the 1830s. These missionaries often disapproved strongly of the drinking, gambling, and general licentiousness they witnessed, writing letters and reports describing rendezvous as dens of sin that shocked their moral sensibilities. However, some developed genuine respect for the Native American peoples they hoped to convert, and for the trappers whose knowledge and skills they recognized as remarkable, even if they deplored their lifestyle choices. The most famous missionary to attend rendezvous was Marcus Whitman, who came to the 1835 gathering along with Samuel Parker to assess possibilities for establishing missions in the Northwest. Whitman would later return to establish a mission near present-day Walla Walla, Washington, where he and his wife Narcissa provided medical care and education to Native Americans and to travelers passing through the region. The Whitman mission would end tragically in 1847, when Marcus, Narcissa, and several others were killed during an attack by Cayuse people who blamed Whitman for bringing diseases that were devastating their population. This tragedy illustrated the complex and often difficult relationships between white Americans and Native peoples. Relationships where genuine good intentions could nevertheless lead to catastrophic outcomes. As rendezvous wound down after several weeks, trappers would purchase the supplies they needed for another year in the mountains, settle accounts, or go into debt with the company representatives and prepare to depart for their trapping territories. Some traveled in small groups for mutual protection, while others preferred to work alone despite the increased risks. They would scatter across vast territories, heading to favorite valleys and streams where they hoped to find beaver, beginning another cycle of isolation, work, and danger. The Native American groups would also depart, returning to their home territories to resume their own seasonal rounds of hunting, gathering, and following the resources that sustained them. The valley that had held hundreds or thousands of people would empty within days, leaving only trash and the trampled ground to show that anything unusual had occurred. The exploration and pathfinding achievements of mountain men represented contributions that extended far beyond the fur trade itself. These men were often the first white Americans to see and traverse vast territories, and their knowledge of geography became crucial to the nation's westward expansion. They discovered mountain passes that would later become major routes for emigrant wagon trains. They identified river routes that could be navigated by boats or followed by travelers on foot or horseback. They created mental maps of the West that were eventually committed to paper and used by cartographers to create the first accurate maps of the region. This geographic knowledge, gained through years of wandering and observation, represented a form of expertise that was genuinely valuable and that contributed significantly to American understanding of the continent's western half. Jim Bridger stands as perhaps the quintessential mountain man explorer, a man whose knowledge of Western geography was encyclopedic and whose discoveries included some of the West's most remarkable features. Bridger is credited with being the first white American to see the Great Salt Lake, that massive body of salt water in present-day Utah that early trappers initially thought might be an arm of the Pacific Ocean. When Bridger tasted the water and found it salty, the mystery was solved, though the lake's size and salinity continued to impress all who saw it. Bridger also explored the Yellowstone region extensively, becoming familiar with its geysers, hot springs, and other geothermal features long before the area became famous. His stories of spouting water and boiling mud were often dismissed as tall tales by people who hadn't seen these phenomena, but they were accurate descriptions of one of the world's most unusual landscapes. Bridger's geographic knowledge proved invaluable to later emigrants and explorers. He could describe routes across mountain ranges, the location of water sources, in apparently waterless deserts, the timing of grass growth in various valleys that determined when livestock could find forage. He understood which passes were feasible for wagons and which were too steep or too narrow. This practical geographic knowledge, accumulated through decades of travel and careful observation, made Bridger sought after as a guide. In his later years, after the beaver trade had collapsed, Bridger established a trading post on the Oregon Trail and worked as a guide for army expeditions and emigrant parties, translating his mountain man expertise into a new career serving those who followed the paths he had pioneered. Jedediah Smith exemplified a different type of mountain man explorer, one who seemed driven by genuine curiosity about geography and by a desire to see what lay beyond the next mountain range. Smith was unusual among mountain men in being a devout Christian who neither drank nor smoked and who carried a Bible with him throughout his travels. Despite, or perhaps because of his abstemiousness, Smith was one of the most successful trappers and explorers of his era, leading expeditions that opened vast new territories to the fur trade and that greatly expanded American geographic knowledge. Smith's most famous expedition occurred in 1826 and 27 when he led a party south and west from the Great Salt Lake, becoming the first white Americans to travel overland to California. The journey took them through deserts that nearly killed them, across mountain ranges that challenged their endurance and skill, and into Mexican California where authorities were suspicious of American intentions but eventually allowed them to trade and resupply before departing. Smith then led his men north through California's Central Valley and attempted to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains, one of the first white Americans to do so. After crossing the mountains with tremendous difficulty, Smith traversed the Great Basin Desert, one of the most hostile environments in North America, to return to the annual rendezvous and report his discoveries. Not content with this remarkable journey, Smith then led another expedition to California the following year, this time planning to travel north along the coast to explore possibilities for trade and trapping in the Pacific Northwest. This expedition encountered disasters, including attacks by Native Americans that killed most of Smith's men. Smith himself survived and eventually made his way to Fort Vancouver, the Hudson's Bay Company post on the Columbia River, where he was received hospitably despite the commercial rivalry between American and British fur companies. Smith eventually returned to the Rocky Mountains, continuing his trapping and exploring career until 1831, when he was killed by Comanche warriors while traveling along the Santa Fe Trail. His death at age 32 ended one of the most remarkable exploration careers in American history, leaving behind journals and maps that contributed significantly to American knowledge of the West. Kit Carson perhaps became the most famous mountain man of all, though his fame came as much from his later career as a guide and military figure as from his trapping years. Carson was small in stature, standing only about 5 feet 6 inches tall, but he possessed remarkable toughness, courage, and skill that earned him tremendous respect among his fellow mountain men. He began his Western career as a teenager, running away from an apprenticeship to join a trading caravan heading to Santa Fe, then working his way into the fur trade through various expeditions and partnerships. Carson trapped throughout the Southern Rockies and the Southwest, learning the country intimately and developing the skills that would later make him an invaluable guide. Carson's marriage to a daughter of a prominent Arapaho chief gave him connections within Native American communities and helped him understand indigenous perspectives and ways of life. After his first wife died, Carson married a Mexican woman in Taos, New Mexico, further demonstrating his ability to move between different cultural worlds. His reputation as a skilled mountain man brought him to the attention of John C. Fremont, the Army officer and explorer who led several government expeditions to map and describe the West. Carson served as Fremont's guide on multiple expeditions, contributing his practical knowledge of geography, Native Americans, and survival to Fremont's more formal scientific observations. Fremont's published reports of his expeditions mentioned Carson frequently, praising his abilities and describing his exploits in terms that made Carson famous far beyond the circle of mountain men who knew him personally. Carson became something of a national celebrity, featured in dime novels that wildly exaggerated his adventures and created a mythologized version of Kit Carson that bore little resemblance to the real man. The actual Carson was competent, brave, and skilled, but he was also often uncomfortable with his fame and expressed frustration with the tall tales told about him. Nevertheless, his reputation helped him transition from mountain man to military officer during the Mexican-American War, and later during the Civil War and various Indian wars, where he served as both scout and commander despite having little formal military training. The role of mountain men as guides and scouts for army expeditions and emigrant trains represented an important economic niche as the fur trade declined. These men possessed knowledge that was literally irreplaceable, understanding of terrain and routes that no amount of book learning could provide. They knew where water could be found in deserts, which mountain passes were navigable, how to read weather signs, how to interact with various Native American groups. This expertise was exactly what army officers and emigrant leaders needed, and mountain men who had failed to save money from their trapping years often found they could make reasonable livings by guiding others through territories they knew intimately. The transition from trapper to guide was not always smooth, as the skills required were somewhat different. A guide needed to be able to communicate clearly with people who had no wilderness experience, to judge the capabilities and limitations of horses, mules, oxen, and wagons, to maintain morale and discipline among groups of people who might panic or make foolish decisions under stress. Some mountain men proved excellent guides, combining their geographic knowledge with leadership abilities and patience. Others were less successful, finding that they lacked the interpersonal skills needed to manage groups of civilians or to work within military hierarchies. Nevertheless, the demand for experienced guides remained strong throughout the 1840s and 50s as emigration to California, Oregon, and Utah increased dramatically. The mountain man's expertise with weapons contributed significantly to his survival and success. The rifles they carried were muzzle-loading, single-shot weapons that required considerable skill to use effectively. Loading a rifle involved a complex sequence of steps, measuring the proper amount of gunpowder from a horn and pouring it down the barrel, placing a greased patch over the muzzle, positioning a lead ball on the patch, using a ramrod to push ball and patch down the barrel until they seated firmly against the powder, and finally placing a percussion cap on the nipple or priming the pan with fine powder, depending on the rifle's ignition system. The entire process might take 30 seconds for an experienced shooter working carefully, or perhaps 20 seconds for someone working rapidly in dangerous situations. This slow rate of fire meant that accuracy was paramount, as there would be no opportunity for a second shot if a grizzly bear was charging or if hostile warriors were attacking. Mountain men practiced constantly, developing the skills needed to judge distance, compensate for wind, account for their rifle's particular characteristics and quirks. They learned to shoot from various positions, standing, kneeling, sitting, prone, adapting to whatever terrain or circumstances presented. They became adept at shooting at moving targets, necessary for hunting fleet animals like elk or antelope. The very best shots could hit targets at ranges that seem remarkable even today, 300 yards or more, with weapons that lack the accuracy and power of modern rifles. Maintenance of firearms required constant attention in wilderness conditions. Moisture was the great enemy, as it could cause powder to become damp and useless or could rust metal parts. Mountain men learned to protect their rifles carefully, keeping them dry, cleaning them regularly, applying oil to prevent rust. The rifle's ignition system required particular care. Flints needed to be napped occasionally to maintain sharp edges that would produce good sparks, while percussion caps were fragile and needed to be kept dry and protected from crushing. Rifle bores fouled with powder residue after firing and required cleaning to maintain accuracy and reliability. A mountain man who neglected his rifle maintenance might find his weapon failing at a critical moment, a potentially fatal mistake that experienced trappers avoided through disciplined care of their equipment. Beyond rifles, mountain men carried other weapons that served various purposes. Pistols provided backup firepower and were particularly useful in close quarters, fighting where a rifle's length became a disadvantage. However, Pistols of the era were even less accurate than rifles, and were effective only at very short ranges. Knives served as both tools and weapons, used for everything from butchering game to defending oneself in hand-to-hand combat. Mountain men typically carried substantial knives with blades 6 inches or longer, weapons that could inflict devastating wounds in skilled hands. The famous Bowie knife, with its distinctive blade shape and substantial size, became popular among mountain men and frontiersmen generally, though many men preferred other designs based on personal taste or availability. Tomahawks combined the functions of hatchet, hammer, and weapon, useful for splitting wood, driving stakes, throwing at targets for practice or in combat. While throwing axes might seem like a romantic notion with little practical application, mountain men did develop considerable skill with thrown tomahawks, and sometimes used them in close-range fighting. However, the tomahawk's primary value was as a tool rather than as a weapon, something that could be used for numerous tasks around camp, and that didn't require the constant maintenance and care that firearms demanded. The art of tracking represented another crucial mountain man skill: the ability to read sign and determine what animals or people had passed through an area, when they had been there, where they were going, and what they were doing. Tracks in soft ground were the most obvious signs, showing the clear imprint of hooves, paws, or moccasins. Experienced trackers could identify species, estimate size and weight, determine direction of travel, and often guess at the speed of movement. They could distinguish fresh tracks from old ones by examining how sharp the edges remained, whether debris had fallen into them, how much moisture they held. Tracking in harder ground or on rock required even greater skill, looking for barely visible scratches, displaced pebbles, or broken vegetation that indicated something had passed. Beyond physical tracks, mountain men learned to read other signs that revealed animal or human presence. Scat indicated what animals had been in an area and what they had been eating. Scratches on trees showed where bears had marked territory or sharpened claws. Broken branches indicated where elk or deer had browsed, or where something large had forced its way through brush. Disturbed birds suggested that something had startled them, possibly a predator or a person moving through the area. Smoke rising in the distance indicated fires, whether from camps or from natural causes. The ability to synthesize all these signs into a coherent understanding of what was happening in an area separated expert woodsmen from those with only basic skills. The mountain man's understanding of weather patterns and natural phenomena helped him avoid dangers and plan his movements effectively. He learned to recognize the signs of approaching storms, particular cloud formations, changes in wind direction, behaviors of animals that suggested bad weather was coming. He understood seasonal patterns, when various mountain passes would become blocked by snow, when rivers would be in flood from snowmelt, when different areas would be too hot or too dry for comfortable travel. This meteorological knowledge, gained through observation and experience rather than formal education, proved remarkably accurate and allowed mountain men to time their movements to avoid the worst weather while taking advantage of favorable conditions. Navigation without compasses or maps required developing an intimate sense of direction and the ability to remember complex routes through featureless terrain. Mountain men learned to navigate by sun and stars, understanding how celestial objects moved across the sky and how to use them to maintain proper heading. They memorized landmarks, distinctive rock formations, particular trees, river bends, anything that could serve as reference points. They learned to estimate distances by time and effort, knowing how far they typically traveled in a day under various conditions. This mental mapping created detailed geographic knowledge that resided entirely in memory, passed from person to person through verbal description and through actually guiding others along routes, rather than through written maps or formal cartography. Horse and mule management represented essential skills for mountain men who relied on these animals for transportation and for carrying equipment and furs. The mountain men learned to judge horses and mules, evaluating their soundness, temperament, and suitability for mountain travel. They became expert at packing animals efficiently, distributing weight properly to avoid creating sores or exhausting the animals prematurely. They learned to recognize and treat common ailments, everything from simple exhaustion to more serious problems like colic or founder. They understood that animals needed to be rested regularly, allowed to graze and drink, protected from predators and theft. A mountain man who mistreated his animals or who failed to care for them properly would find himself afoot, carrying his own equipment, dramatically reducing his range and effectiveness. The relationship between mountain men and their horses or mules often became quite close, as these animals were companions as well as tools, sharing hardships and dangers, sometimes for years at a time. A good horse or mule represented significant investment and could make the difference between success and failure, between life and death in dangerous situations. Mountain men gave their animals names, spoke to them, developed bonds similar to those between any person and an animal they depend on absolutely. The loss of a horse or mule, whether through death, injury, or theft, was a serious matter that could end a trapping season or force a man to completely alter his plans. The leatherworking skills that mountain men developed were essential for maintaining their clothing and equipment in serviceable condition. Buckskin garments required regular repairs as they wore through at stress points or tore on thorns and rocks. Mountain men learned to sew with needle and thread, often using sinew from animals. They killed rather than manufactured thread. They learned to soften leather that had become stiff after getting wet and drying, a process that might involve working the leather by hand for hours. Working brain-tanned leather was particularly soft and remained pliable even after repeated wettings. And mountain men sometimes learned this technique from Native American wives or trading partners. Beyond repairs, mountain men sometimes made new clothing items from scratch, cutting patterns, stitching pieces together, adding fringe that served both decorative and functional purposes. The fringe on buckskin shirts and pants wasn't just for appearance, it helped water run off rather than soaking into the garment, and in an emergency, fringe could be cut off to provide leather cord for repairs or other needs. Some mountain men became quite skilled at leatherwork, creating garments that were well-fitted, durable, and decorated with quillwork or beadwork, acquired through trade or through marriage, to Native American women who possessed these skills. Tool-making and repair skills were similarly important, as manufactured tools that broke couldn't simply be replaced in the wilderness. Mountain men learned basic blacksmithing, able to use fire and hammer to repair broken trap springs, or to reshape knife blades that had chipped or broken. They learned to replace broken rifle stocks, shaping new ones from appropriate wood when the original broke. They could fashion emergency replacement parts for various pieces of equipment, improvising solutions that might not be elegant, but that worked well enough to get them through until they could obtain proper replacements. This versatility and resourcefulness, the ability to solve practical problems with limited materials and tools, characterized successful mountain men and distinguished them from those who required support systems and specialized craftsmen to maintain their equipment. The coffee that mountain men prized, when they could get it, represented more than just a beverage. It was a taste of civilization, a luxury that reminded them of comforts they had left behind, and a source of caffeine that could help combat fatigue during long days. However, coffee was expensive at rendezvous and heavy to carry in quantities. So many mountain men went without, for extended periods, drinking only water or herbal teas made from plants they found. When they did have coffee, they typically brewed it strong, using grounds multiple times before discarding them, creating a bitter, powerful drink that bore little resemblance to the refined coffee served in eastern cities. Tobacco was another valued commodity, used by most mountain men either for smoking in pipes or for chewing. Tobacco provided stimulation, helped pass time during long, boring waits, and gave users something to focus on besides their discomforts and dangers. Like coffee, tobacco was expensive and had to be conserved carefully when supplies were limited. Some mountain men developed such strong habits that they would trade valuable items for tobacco when they ran out, while others remained indifferent to it and saved their resources for items they considered more essential. The social ritual of sharing a pipe was important in both mountain man gatherings and in interactions with Native Americans, where pipe smoking often accompanied discussions and served as a way of establishing peaceful intentions. The decline of the mountain man era occurred gradually but inexorably over the course of the 1830s and early 1840s, driven by several interrelated factors. The most obvious was the decline in beaver populations, as decades of intensive trapping reduced the numbers of these animals dramatically throughout their range. Beaver, while reasonably prolific, could not reproduce fast enough to sustain the harvest levels that trappers were imposing. Valley after valley that had once held abundant beaver became depleted, forcing trappers to range ever farther in search of untapped territories. By the late 1830s, many trappers reported that finding beaver had become much more difficult than in earlier years, and the catches that had once seemed easy to obtain now required enormous effort for much smaller returns. Compounding the problem of declining beaver populations was a shift in fashion preferences in Europe and the eastern United States. The tall beaver hat that had dominated men's fashion for decades began to fall out of favor in the 1830s, replaced by silk hats that didn't require fur at all. This shift reduced demand for beaver pelts dramatically, causing prices to fall just as the supply was becoming more difficult to obtain. The combination of lower prices and fewer animals created an economic squeeze that made trapping increasingly unprofitable. Trappers who had once been able to make good livings found themselves working harder for less return, and many began looking for alternative ways to earn money or simply left the mountains to return to more settled areas. The increasing settlement of the West also contributed to the end of the mountain man era, as wagon trains of emigrants began moving through territories that had once been the exclusive domain of trappers and Native Americans. The Oregon Trail, California Trail, and Mormon Trail brought thousands of settlers westward starting in the early 1840s, transforming the wilderness into routes of travel and eventually into settled territories, with farms, towns, and all the infrastructure of civilization. This settlement displaced both the beaver and the Native American peoples whose lands were being occupied, further reducing opportunities for traditional mountain man activities. At the same time, settlement created new opportunities for men with mountain skills, opportunities to serve as guides, to operate ferries or trading posts along emigrant routes, to work as scouts for army units, protecting settlers, or fighting with Native American groups resisting displacement. The last rendezvous occurred in 1840, though no one knew at the time that it would be the final gathering. Attendance was lower than in previous years, reflecting the declining profitability of beaver trapping and the dispersal of trappers into other activities. The trading that occurred was less extensive, with fewer furs changing hands and less enthusiasm for the wild celebrations that had characterized earlier rendezvous. Within a few years, the rendezvous system had ended entirely, with no more supply caravans departing St. Louis to meet trappers in the mountains. The era of the mountain man as independent trapper had ended. Though individual men would continue to trap on smaller scales for decades, and though the skills and knowledge that mountain men had developed would remain valuable in the West's continuing development. Many former mountain men successfully transitioned to new roles that utilized their frontier expertise. As already mentioned, some became guides for emigrant trains and military expeditions, translating their geographic knowledge into a new profession. Others established trading posts or ranches, using their understanding of the land and their connections with Native Americans to build successful businesses. Some became employees of the government, working as Indian agents, fort commanders, or scouts for army units. A few wrote memoirs or gave lectures about their experiences, contributing to the growing body of literature about the American West and helping shape how Americans understood their frontier heritage. Jim Bridger established Fort Bridger in southwestern Wyoming in 1843, creating a trading post that served emigrants on the Oregon Trail, and that later became an important military installation. Bridger operated this post for several years, selling supplies to passing wagon trains, providing blacksmith services, and offering advice about routes and conditions ahead. He continued working as a guide and scout well into the 1860s, remaining active in the West until old age and failing health finally forced him to retire. When he died in 1881 at the age of 77, he had lived long enough to see the wild frontier he had known as a young man transformed into a network of railroads, cities, and farms. Kit Carson's later career included service in the Mexican-American War, where he carried dispatches and served as a guide for Army units operating in New Mexico and California. After the war, Carson worked as an Indian agent, attempting with mixed success to mediate between Native American peoples and the American government. During the Civil War, he commanded New Mexico volunteer troops fighting Confederate forces and hostile Native Americans. He led campaigns against the Navajo that resulted in their forced relocation to Bosque Redondo, an episode that remains controversial, and that represented the darker side of frontier history, where expansion and settlement involved the displacement and often destruction of indigenous peoples and their ways of life. Carson died in 1868 at age 58, worn out by decades of hard living and by the diseases and injuries he had accumulated. The mountain man's legacy extended far beyond their actual numbers or the relatively brief period during which they operated. At the peak of the fur trade era, perhaps only a few hundred men were actively working as mountain men at any given time, a tiny number compared to the thousands of farmers, merchants, and laborers who made up the bulk of American population. Yet these few hundred men explored vast territories, established routes that hundreds of thousands would later follow, developed relationships with Native American peoples that shaped subsequent interactions, and created a cultural mythology that would influence American identity for generations. The image of the mountain man became embedded in American culture as a symbol of independence, self-reliance, courage, and freedom. The mountain man represented a particular ideal of masculinity, the strong, capable man who needed no one, who could survive and thrive in the harshest conditions, who was comfortable with danger and unafraid of death. This idealized version of the mountain man often bore little resemblance to the actual historical figures, who were more complex, more human, more vulnerable than the legend suggested. Nevertheless, the mythology proved powerful and persistent, influencing everything from popular entertainment to political rhetoric to personal identity formation for Americans seeking to understand themselves and their nation's character. The mountain man's relationship with Native Americans was complex and defies simple categorization. Individual trappers displayed the full range of human behavior toward Native peoples, from respect and genuine friendship to exploitation and violence. Some mountain men lived peacefully with various tribes for years, learning languages, adopting customs, raising mixed heritage children who bridged cultural worlds. Others saw Native Americans primarily as obstacles or as sources of danger, maintaining hostile or suspicious attitudes throughout their careers. Most fell somewhere between these extremes, forming specific relationships with specific individuals or groups, while remaining wary of others, recognizing the complexity and diversity of Native American societies rather than seeing them as a monolithic category. It is important to recognize that the mountain man era occurred during a period of catastrophic change and decline for Native American peoples across North America. Diseases introduced by European contact killed enormous numbers of native people, sometimes reducing tribal populations by half or more within a generation. The fur trade itself disrupted traditional economies and social structures, creating dependence on manufactured goods and encouraging overharvesting of fur-bearing animals that native peoples had traditionally managed sustainably. The mountain men were participants in these larger processes of change and displacement, regardless of their individual intentions or attitudes toward Native Americans. The routes they pioneered and the geographic knowledge they accumulated would soon be used by emigrants and soldiers whose presence would ultimately destroy the indigenous societies of the West. The environmental impact of the fur trade extended beyond just the reduction of beaver populations. The intensive trapping removed a keystone species whose dam-building activities had shaped entire ecosystems. Beaver dams created wetlands that supported diverse plant and animal communities, moderated stream flows, reduced erosion, and created habitat for countless other species. When beavers were removed from watersheds, these wetlands often drained, streams cut deeper channels, erosion increased, and the character of riparian areas changed dramatically. The full extent of these changes would not be understood for many decades, but they represented genuine ecological transformations that altered Western landscapes in ways that persist to this day. The physical toughness required for mountain man life is difficult for modern people to fully appreciate. Living as we do with central heating, modern medicine, abundant food, and relative safety. Mountain men endured conditions that would hospitalize or kill most contemporary individuals within days or weeks. They worked in temperatures that ranged from well over 100 degrees in summer to 40 below zero in winter, often without adequate clothing or shelter. They went without food for days at a time, surviving on their body's reserves while continuing to work and travel. They suffered injuries that would require immediate medical attention today, but that they treated themselves or simply endured, hoping their bodies would heal before infection or complications killed them. The psychological toll of such a life should not be underestimated. The isolation, the constant danger, the physical hardship, and the uncertainty all created stress that affected mental health in various ways. Some men thrived under these conditions, finding that the simplicity and clarity of wilderness life suited them better than the complications of civilization. Others gradually wore down, developing what might today be recognized as post-traumatic stress, depression, or other mental health conditions. The heavy drinking that characterized many mountain men's behavior at rendezvous likely reflected attempts at self-medication, ways of coping with accumulated stress and trauma. The fact that many mountain men seemed unable to readjust to settled life after years in the wilderness suggests that their experiences had changed them in fundamental ways, making it difficult or impossible to return to the conventional social world they had left. Sleep in the wilderness was often interrupted and inadequate, as mountain men had to remain alert for dangers even during rest. A man sleeping alone in grizzly country or in territory where hostile Native Americans might attack had to sleep lightly, waking at any unusual sound, ready to defend himself at a moment's notice. This chronic sleep deprivation affected judgment, mood, and physical health, contributing to the overall stress load that mountain men carried. The rare opportunities to sleep deeply and securely, perhaps during winter when snowed in at a sheltered camp or during rendezvous when surrounded by others, were precious and much appreciated. The diet mountain men consumed would be considered extremely unhealthy by modern nutritional standards, consisting primarily of meat with little variety or supplementation from plant sources. This high-protein, high-fat diet provided abundant calories needed for the intense physical work and for maintaining body temperature in cold weather, but it lacked essential vitamins and minerals. The resulting nutritional deficiencies manifested in various ways, from scurvy during extended periods without fresh food to other less obvious health problems that accumulated over time. Mountain men who supplemented their meat diet with berries, roots, and other plant foods when available fared better than those who ate almost nothing but meat, though even the best mountain man diet would be considered deficient in numerous ways. The constant exposure to the elements aged mountain men prematurely, with men in their 40s often looking like they were in their 60s or older. Sun exposure damaged skin, creating deep wrinkles and weathered complexions. Frostbite left permanent damage to extremities. Injuries that healed improperly caused chronic pain and reduced mobility. Years of hard physical work wore out joints and backs. Many mountain men who survived to old age, and relatively few did, spent their later years crippled and in pain, bearing the accumulated damage from decades of punishing lifestyle. Despite all the hardships, dangers, and ultimate futility of trying to make the beaver trade sustainable, many mountain men looked back on their trapping years as the best time of their lives. They spoke and wrote with nostalgia about the freedom they had experienced, the beauty of the wilderness they had witnessed, the adventures they had lived through, and the companionship of other men who had shared their extraordinary way of life. For these men, the mountain man years represented a peak experience, a time when they had felt most alive, most themselves, most engaged with the world in all its raw power and beauty. The fact that this way of life was ultimately unsustainable, that it caused environmental damage and contributed to the displacement of indigenous peoples, that it left many participants physically broken and financially poor, did not diminish their memories of those years, or their sense that they had lived more fully than most people ever would. The mountain man era also represented a particular moment in American history, a brief window when the frontier was genuinely wild and largely unmapped, when individuals could still strike out on their own and survive or fail based primarily on their own skills and efforts, when the outcome of continental expansion was not yet determined, and when different futures still seemed possible. Within a few decades, the frontier would be essentially closed, with railroads spanning the continent, telegraph lines connecting distant settlements, army posts established across the West, and indigenous peoples confined to reservations. The wild spaces where mountain men had roamed would be divided into states and territories, surveyed and mapped, open to homesteaders and miners and ranchers who would transform the landscape in ways that made the mountain man's life impossible, even had the beaver remained abundant. The skills that mountain men developed, while impressive and genuinely valuable in their context, became increasingly obsolete as the frontier closed and as modern technology changed how people interacted with wilderness. The ability to track animals became less important when market hunters could simply shoot into vast herds of buffalo without bothering to track individual animals. The knowledge of remote mountain passes became less valuable when railroads provided easier routes across the mountains. The ability to survive for months with minimal equipment became unnecessary when supply points existed every few days' travel apart. In a sense, the mountain man represented a late flowering of skills and knowledge that humans had been developing for thousands of years, but that would largely disappear within a generation or two as industrialization and modernization changed the very nature of human relationship with the natural world. Today, the memory and mythology of mountain men persists in various forms. Historical reenactors gather at modern rendezvous to recreate the experience of fur trade gatherings, though obviously in much more comfortable and safer conditions than the original events. Museums display mountain man artifacts, from beaver traps to buckskin clothing to the weapons and tools that trappers carried. Academic historians continue to study the fur trade era, producing books and articles that examine various aspects of mountain man life and the larger economic and social systems within which they operated. Popular culture continues to reference mountain men in movies, television shows, and books, though these representations often simplify and romanticize the actual historical experience. The values associated with mountain men, independence, self-reliance, courage, toughness, connection with nature, continue to resonate in American culture, particularly in Western states where the mountain man heritage is most strongly felt. The image of the solitary man thriving in wilderness through his own skills and determination remains a powerful cultural ideal, even as the actual possibility of living such a life has largely disappeared. This persistence suggests that the mountain man mythology speaks to something deeper than simple historical interest, perhaps to longings for freedom and adventure that modern life often fails to satisfy, or to desires for simpler times when human agency seemed more direct, and when the relationship between effort and result seemed more clear. The environmental restoration of beaver populations that has occurred in many Western watersheds over the past several decades represents, in some sense, a reversal of the mountain man legacy. Beavers have been reintroduced to many streams where they had been extirpated during the fur trade era, and their dam building activities are once again creating wetlands and modifying riparian ecosystems. This restoration demonstrates nature's resilience when given the opportunity to recover, but it also serves as a reminder of how dramatically the fur trade era altered Western landscapes and ecosystems. The beaver that today's wildlife watchers observe building dams in mountain streams are descendants of the few survivors who escaped the intensive trapping of the mountain man era, populations that have slowly recovered over more than a century. The question of how to properly remember and commemorate the mountain men involves balancing several competing considerations. On one hand, these were individuals who accomplished remarkable things, exploring vast territories under incredibly difficult conditions, surviving through skills and toughness that deserve recognition and respect. They were genuine pioneers who opened the West to later settlement and whose geographic knowledge proved invaluable to the nation's expansion. On the other hand, they were participants in economic and environmental exploitation that caused lasting damage, and their activities contributed to the displacement and often destruction of Native American peoples and societies. A balanced historical understanding should acknowledge both their achievements and their roles in these larger destructive processes. Recognizing complexity rather than resorting to simple hero worship or condemnation. The study of mountain men also offers insights into human adaptability and the ways that people can develop expertise and thrive in challenging environments when necessity demands it. Most mountain men arrived in the wilderness with minimal relevant skills, yet within a few years they had mastered complex knowledge systems that allowed them not merely to survive, but to prosper. This transformation demonstrates human capacity for learning and adaptation, showing that people can develop remarkable capabilities when circumstances require it and when they commit themselves fully to the necessary learning process. The fact that these skills could be learned relatively quickly by motivated individuals suggests that human beings retain considerable latent capacity for practical competence even in the modern world, where such skills are rarely needed or developed. The role of mentorship and social learning in the mountain man world deserves emphasis. While popular mythology often depicts mountain men as solitary figures who learned everything through individual trial and error, the reality was more social. Experienced mountain men taught newcomers, passing on crucial knowledge about trapping techniques, survival skills, and safe ways to navigate various dangers. Native Americans taught trappers about local plants, animal behaviors, and territorial features that would have taken years to discover independently. This knowledge transmission was often informal and occurred through observation and participation rather than through formal instruction, but it was nonetheless crucial to the development of mountain man expertise. The willingness to learn from others, regardless of their ethnic or cultural background, separated successful mountain men from those who failed or died because they thought they already knew everything they needed to know. The economic structure of the fur trade, with its boom and bust cycles, its creation of debt relationships between trappers and companies, and its ultimate collapse, offers lessons about resource extraction industries more generally. The pattern of rapid exploitation of a natural resource, enrichment of company owners and investors, while workers received relatively little, despite taking all the risks, followed by resource depletion and economic collapse, has been repeated many times in American history with timber, mining, fishing, and other extractive industries. The mountain man era provides a clear early example of this pattern and might have served as a warning about the consequences of unsustainable resource use, though subsequent generations seem to have learned little from this example. The transformation of the American West from a region of wilderness and indigenous societies to a region of farms, ranches, mines, and cities occurred with remarkable speed, taking only about 50 years from the beginning of the mountain man era to the official closing of the frontier in 1890. The mountain men were at the vanguard of this transformation, serving as scouts and pathfinders whether they intended that role or not. Their presence in the wilderness, their reports of vast resources waiting to be exploited, their creation of routes and maps, all encouraged the waves of settlement that followed. In this sense, the mountain men were agents of the massive changes that would reshape the West, even though individual trappers might have preferred that the wilderness remain wild, and that their way of life continue indefinitely. The concept of wilderness itself underwent transformation during and after the mountain man era. For Native Americans, the lands where mountain men trapped were not wilderness, but rather ancestral homelands that had been occupied and managed by human communities for thousands of years. For mountain men, these same lands were wild places where they could escape civilization's constraints and live according to their own rules. For the emigrants who followed, the wilderness represented an obstacle to be overcome, transformed through agriculture and settlement into productive farmland. For modern environmentalists, wilderness represents precious habitat that should be protected from development and preserved in its natural state. These different understandings of the same landscapes reflect different values, different needs, and different relationships with the natural world, and none can be simply dismissed as wrong, while another is elevated as correct. The personal stories of individual mountain men reveal tremendous diversity in their backgrounds, motivations, experiences, and ultimate fates. Some, like Jedediah Smith, were driven by genuine curiosity and religious faith, seeing their explorations as opportunities to expand human knowledge and to spread Christianity. Others, like Jim Bridger, were motivated primarily by practical concerns, making livings through trapping and trading, becoming expert at what they did simply through years of practice and attention. Still others seem to have been drawn primarily by the freedom and adventure that mountain life offered, less concerned with economic success or geographic discovery than with living according to their own desires rather than society's expectations. Some mountain men died young, killed by grizzly bears, by accidents, by disease, by violence with Native Americans or with other white men. Others survived to old age, transitioning successfully to new careers and living to see the West completely transformed from the wilderness they had known in their youth. Some died poor, despite years of hard work, having spent their earnings recklessly, or having never managed to accumulate significant wealth from their trapping. Others used their mountain earnings or their later work as guides to establish comfortable lives, buying property, starting businesses, or securing government positions that provided security in their old age. The range of outcomes was as varied as the men themselves, reflecting both the role of luck in determining success or failure and the importance of individual choices and character in shaping one's life trajectory. The physical artifacts that remain from the mountain man era, rifles, traps, knives, clothing, and various other objects, now reside in museums and private collections, carefully preserved as historical objects. These artifacts provide tangible connections to the past, allowing modern people to see and sometimes handle the actual tools and equipment that mountain men used. A beaver trap displayed in a museum case, with its heavy springs and cruel jaws, communicates something about the reality of trapping that no amount of description can quite convey. Similarly, a buckskin shirt worn by an actual mountain man, with its grease stains, repairs, and decorative beadwork, tells stories of its use and of the person who wore it in ways that words cannot fully capture. These objects serve as important historical resources, helping us understand the material culture of the mountain man era and connecting us directly to these long-dead individuals and their experiences. The landscape itself serves as another kind of artifact, bearing the marks of mountain man activity even after many generations. Old trap lines can sometimes still be traced through mountain valleys. Trails that mountain men followed became roads and eventually highways. Trading posts that served the fur trade evolved into towns and cities. The names that mountain men gave to various geographic features, mountains, rivers, passes, valleys, remain on modern maps, commemorating individuals and events from the fur trade era. Traveling through the West with awareness of this history allows one to see these landscapes not as empty wilderness, but as places with rich human histories where remarkable events occurred and where people lived lives of extraordinary drama and difficulty. The question of what drove men to choose such a difficult and dangerous life has no single answer, as motivations varied as widely as the individuals themselves. Economic opportunity certainly attracted many, as the potential earnings from a good trapping season exceeded what most working men could make through conventional labor. The promise of adventure and excitement drew others who found settled life boring or confining. Some were fleeing from problems in their home communities, from debts, failed relationships, legal troubles, or simply from families and communities where they didn't fit. The wilderness offered fresh starts and the possibility of reinventing oneself, becoming someone new in a place where past failures or mistakes need not define future possibilities. For some mountain men, the attraction seems to have been primarily psychological and spiritual rather than economic or practical. These were individuals who genuinely needed the solitude and challenges that wilderness provided, who felt constrained and uncomfortable in civilized settings, who found meaning and purpose in testing themselves against nature. For such men, the hardships of mountain life were not prices to be paid for economic gain, but rather were themselves valuable experiences, opportunities to discover their own capabilities and limits, to prove to themselves that they could survive and thrive under the most demanding conditions imaginable. The fact that many such men seemed unable to readjust to civilized life after their mountain years suggests that something fundamental in their characters required the kind of intense engagement with life that wilderness provided and that settlement could not offer. The legacy of toughness associated with mountain men has influenced American culture's understanding of masculinity and strength. The mountain man represents a particular ideal, the man who needs no one, who can handle any problem through his own skills and determination, who faces danger without flinching, who survives through sheer toughness when lesser men would die. This ideal has both positive and negative aspects. On the positive side, it celebrates genuine capabilities, courage, and self-reliance that can be admirable qualities. On the negative side, it can create unrealistic expectations, encourage men to hide vulnerability or refuse help even when needed, and suggest that the only valid form of manhood involves physical toughness and stoicism. A more nuanced understanding recognizes that mountain men exhibited various forms of strength, including the willingness to learn from others, the ability to adapt to circumstances, and the wisdom to recognize when caution was more appropriate than boldness. The mountain men's interactions with the natural world reflected perspectives that modern environmentalists might view with mixed feelings. On one hand, mountain men developed deep knowledge of nature and often spoke and wrote with genuine appreciation for the beauty and power of wilderness. They understood animal behavior intimately, recognized the interconnections within ecosystems, and sometimes expressed concern about the overexploitation of beaver and other resources. On the other hand, their economic activities involved killing animals in large numbers, disrupting ecosystems, and participating in unsustainable resource extraction that caused lasting environmental damage. This contradiction reflects the complexity of human relationships with nature, where appreciation and exploitation often coexist, where people can love the natural world while simultaneously destroying it for practical or economic reasons. The role of women in the mountain man world, while often overlooked in traditional accounts, was actually quite significant. Native American women provided essential labor and knowledge, preparing hides, making clothing, gathering plant foods, and serving as cultural interpreters. The wives of mountain men were true partners in survival, contributing skills and work that were absolutely necessary for success. Mixed heritage women who had both Native American and European ancestry often played particularly important roles, able to move between different cultural worlds and to facilitate communication and trade between groups that might otherwise have remained hostile or suspicious. The contributions of these women deserve recognition, alongside the more celebrated activities of male trappers, as the mountain man world could not have functioned without their labor, knowledge, and diplomacy. Some women also participated more directly in trapping and trading, though their numbers were small and their stories are often poorly documented. A. Few Native American women trapped alongside male partners or even independently. Some women managed trading posts while their husbands or fathers were in the field. Others provided crucial services like guiding, interpreting, or doctoring that supported the fur trade infrastructure. The fact that these women's contributions have often been minimized or ignored in historical accounts reflects gender biases in how history has traditionally been recorded and remembered, privileging male activities while overlooking or undervaluing women's roles, even when those roles were essential. As we reflect on the mountain men and their era from our contemporary vantage point, certain themes emerge that seem worth considering. The mountain men demonstrated remarkable adaptability and capability, developing skills that allowed them to thrive in conditions that would defeat most people. They showed both the possibilities and limits of individual agency, accomplishing extraordinary things through their own efforts, while also being subject to larger forces, economic systems, environmental realities, technological changes that shaped outcomes regardless of individual desires or efforts. They participated in both impressive achievements, exploring and mapping vast territories, establishing routes that bound the nation together, surviving and often thriving under incredibly difficult conditions and in destructive processes, depleting wildlife, displacing indigenous peoples, participating in unsustainable resource extraction. This complexity resists simple moral judgments and instead requires careful consideration of historical context, competing values, and unintended consequences. The Mountain Man era reminds us that human history involves constant change, that ways of life that seem permanent eventually disappear, that skills and knowledge that once seemed essential can become obsolete within a generation. It also demonstrates that individuals can accomplish remarkable things when circumstances demand adaptation and when they commit themselves fully to mastering new skills and knowledge. Perhaps most importantly, it illustrates the enduring human fascination with wilderness, with places where nature remains powerful and largely uncontrolled by human systems, where individuals can test themselves against elemental challenges and discover their own capabilities and limits. This fascination persists in modern adventure tourism, in wilderness recreation, in the continued allure of wild places, despite or perhaps because of their rarity, in an increasingly developed world. As darkness falls over the same mountains and valleys where mountain men once trapped and camped, where they faced bears and storms and hunger, where they found beauty and freedom and danger in equal measure, those wild places remain, changed but recognizable. The mountains still rise with the same grandeur, the streams still run cold and clear, the stars still shine with the same brilliance that amazed trappers almost 2 centuries ago. The beaver have returned to many watersheds, building dams and creating wetlands as their ancestors did before the fur trade era. The wilderness persists, diminished and fragmented, but still present, still capable of inspiring awe and offering challenges to those who venture into it. And the memory of the mountain men persists as well, part of American mythology and history, reminding us of a time when the continent was younger and wilder, when individuals could still disappear into vast, unmapped territories and live or die based primarily on their own skills and luck, when the story of westward expansion was still being written, and different futures still seemed possible. The mountain men were, in the end, products of their time, shaped by the specific circumstances of early 19th century America, while also helping to shape those circumstances through their actions and choices. They were not superhuman figures, though their accomplishments were extraordinary. They were not simply heroes or villains, though elements of both can be found in their stories. They were human beings who lived intensely and often briefly, who chose difficult paths that tested them utterly, who succeeded and failed in various measures, and who left behind a legacy that continues to influence how Americans understand themselves, their history, and their relationship with the wildlands that once covered most of the continent. In remembering them, we honor genuine toughness and capability while also acknowledging the costs and consequences of the economic and territorial expansion in which they participated, seeking a balanced understanding that does justice to historical complexity rather than simplifying the past into comfortable narratives that confirm our present preferences and values. The toughness of the mountain men was real, forged through necessity in conditions that tested every aspect of human endurance and capability. They were indeed among the toughest people on Earth, not because they were somehow different from other humans in their fundamental nature, but because circumstances demanded extraordinary toughness from anyone who would survive in the wilderness they entered. They developed that toughness through experience, through surviving hardships that broke others, through learning from mistakes when such learning was possible, and learning from the knowledge of those who came before when such teachers were available. Their story is ultimately one of human adaptation and achievement under extreme conditions, a story that can inspire while also cautioning us about the costs of such achievement and about the unsustainability of ways of life built on the exploitation of finite resources. In the mountains and valleys of the American West, where their presence is still felt in names on maps and in stories passed down through generations, the mountain men achieved a kind of immortality, remembered as emblems of a particular frontier toughness and independence that shaped and continues to shape American identity and imagination.